To face the Necrons in battle is to stand against death incarnate. It is to know the terror of annihilation at the hands of beings who should be long rotted in their graves. The Necrons' enemies see implacable android revenants rise from their crypts or step from amidst flickering witchlights to destroy all before them. In return, the Necrons see only vermin, interlopers, and savages that must be eradicated in order for their mighty dynasties of old to rise again. Once, 60 million years ago, the Necrons' armies might have achieved their galactic conquest with singular efficiency, yet aeons of slumber in cold stasis have seen madness creep into the minds of their noble masters, as the stately dance of their stars themselves has scattered and ravaged their worlds. What arises now to reclaim the galaxy is an altogether more twisted species, scattered, factionalized and riven by an insanity that has transformed many of their number into walking nightmares. The Necrons of the 41st millennium are a dark reflection of their faded glories, yet they are no less deadly for all this. In monstrosity and madness, the Necrons are rendered more terrible than ever before.
Welcome back to Half-Crafted. The Warhammer 40k 10th edition Necrons Codex is a bit of a story of two halves for me. When I first got into Warhammer 40k, before I went out and got any books, I wanted to learn the faction, so I went out and bought a Necrons Codex. Now, a Warhammer 40k Codex is meant to be the stopping point for you to learn about the faction that you want to get into. It should contain all the information that you need in an easy and compact way to learn the fluff, the lore of the faction, and to learn the crunchy bits of the faction, how to actually play the game if you want to. I say it's a tale of two halves because, on one hand, there's a lot of lore packed into this codex. I feel like you could pick this book up knowing nothing, and by the time you've read through it, you could have a very good impression of what the Necrons are all about. But if we're talking about originality, a lot of this codex has been reused from previous editions. I've tried to give an unbiased and informative review of the codex in this video. It's worked out to be quite long, it's nearly an hour, but I hope that if you're thinking about buying the 10th edition codex to play Warhammer 40k in 10th edition, this video might help you decide if you want to get it. If you do, there's an Element Games affiliate link in the description if you're in the UK to get a bit of a discount and chuck me some pennies. So that's a bit of a first and overall impression. And in the rest of the video, I'm going to break down everything from the lore all the way to the detachments and the units. If you've had a look into the Necron's 10th edition codex so far, or any of the other codexes that have come out, let me know in the description what you think of 10th edition codexes, and if we still need them. I think we do, but I think that's for everyone else to decide themselves. So sit back, enjoy, maybe get some miniatures out to paint, and let's settle in for a good old lore dump. The lore of this codex begins with a really interesting, almost poem-like story about Amnok, a overlord who is in battle with some Eldar. And as you read through the story, you sort of see how Amnok is reminded of these moments from his previous life as a Necrontyr before biotransference. Moments from battle where he sees Eldar fall, or he looks up to the stars, and he is reminded of these previous things that are remnants of memories in his mind. They claw at his mind but are slightly just out of grasp. Obviously the destroyer cults, which have this crazy desire to destroy all organic life. The Flayer virus, which can spread between Necrons and gives them this crazed need to devour flesh and cover themselves in flesh. This story reflects on a lesser side of that. It's just a sort of light dementia, I suppose, where he feels like he can remember something but not quite, and it's really interesting to see the varies of them. They're not all either completely sane or completely mad, but there's degrees there. Following that story is the quote that I read at the beginning of this video, "In search of immortality." This is where we see the first glimmers of repetition being used in this codex compared to 9th edition. However, it does sum up very well what the Necrons are about. I think this is an excellent summary of the Necron faction. And it leads into quite a fleshed out lore section detailing the war in heaven, the awakening, and the journey that the Necron have been through to get to where they are today. To a long-time Necron fan, this might not be any surprise or anything new, but I think to a newcomer to 40k, to a new Necron player, it gives a very comprehensive overview of the Necrons, detailing the massive variety of Necron dynasties that there are, and going into some detail about some of the smaller ones. I think overall it gives a good taste and a good flavour of all the different dynasties and how you can flavour your own. There are so many, so varied. This universe of 40k is so big that you can sort of choose your own to a degree. You can take inspiration or you can make up your own, and it's fine, especially with how the rules are in 10th edition, where they're not fixed to any dynasty in particular. You're more free to choose your own playstyle, choose your own lore, and then pull upon the information that you have in the Codex or in the books to build on that. A lot of these sections are reused from 9th edition. I went through briefly in the 9th edition Codex and had a look, and a lot of the paragraphs are just taken word for word and pasted into this. There is a bit of embellishment here and there. For example, I think there's a bit more development on the Pariah Nexus, Illuminor Zeraz, the Silent King, and the Technomandrites, which are given a bit more detail, obviously, because of how they play into the Pariah Nexus and how that is affecting the 40k verse at the moment. The new show on Warhammer Plus, the Pariah Nexus, is obviously a storyline that they want to follow. Also, throughout this lore section, there are little excerpts at the side of the main lore chunks, which give you sort of snippets, little lore nuggets, sub-stories that, again, give more little tastes of lore, give more little pieces to help build on that world, build on the universe, and how the Necron play into that. We do get a double-page spread on the Pariah Nexus in this codex, with some small excerpts from stories involved in the Pariah Nexus. Vantis 3, Yastan Delta, Borhorsis. I suppose these are similar to the Amnatep 2 stories that we got in the previous codex, although that was just one planet, different parts of one planet. This is more larger scale, everything going on within the Pariah Nexus, the area that it covers, and some of the key points that are crucial to the Silent King and Zera's plan for the Pariah Nexus, detailing nodal systems, outlier systems, plundered or stilled systems, and the various different borders that the Pariah Nexus is operating within. It's really good that we've got something visual like this to explain, because it can be very hard to understand what areas things are taking place in within the 41st millennium when there are so many planets and systems involved. It's not extremely clear, but it is more clear than the previous codex, which had a galaxy graph of the awakening empires, and for me at least it was impossible to read or make any sense of. This is a little better. You've got clearly named planets and systems involved. Matching that up with other stuff in 40k might not be so easy. You're probably just gonna have to read about it and go, oh yeah, I remember the Vertigus system, but it's better than nothing. We've got some reference material to use. The following chapter, Eldritch Artifice, goes into some technical detail about some of the weaponry of the Necron and some of their technological boons that they deploy. Things like Gorse weaponry and Mythic weaponry, Doomsday weapons, Death Rays. A lot of it, again, is taken from the 9th edition Codex, paragraphs that have been copy-pasted, but there are some good nuggets in here. There's an excerpt about crypto thralls, detailing how effectively they are Necron bodies which have fallen beyond use for the Necron itself. So Cryptex take a canoptic construct parasite and attach it to the top of the body. There's a chilling paragraph at the bottom that says, "Nobles find crypto thralls' composite creations distasteful, yet few suspect a darker truth, that the Necron endures long after the implantation. Over time, the invasive filament disassembles the Necron's mind as it silently screams." That's just terrifying stuff. Very 40k, love it. More detail after that about the Catan shards, obviously, the tomb worlds, the defenses of the tomb worlds, that sort of thing. It's good stuff for the world building of Necrons, but again, if you're a seasoned Necron enjoyer, it's probably nothing fresh. The Myriad Dynasty chapter details less of famed dynasties and what they're about, pirate dynasties and ghost dynasties and all sorts, and it's very interesting stuff, but it's all taken from the 9th edition Codex. Paragraph for paragraph it reads the same, and with some of the excerpts at the side giving a bit more to add to that, sometimes you notice a bit of repetition going on even within the Codex. I remember reading about one dynasty or pharaoh or something at the side of a page, and then a few pages later reading about about it in the main text of the paragraph. So obviously they haven't thought about these things too much. They're just trying to slap content into it. And it is standalone, quite full of lore. The following chapter is entitled Lords of the Stars, and this details the hierarchy of the Necrons. We get a couple more paragraphs here, 4 columns instead of 3 across 2 pages, but we miss out on the handy diagram that they had in the last edition, which could be helpful for newer players to visualize how it all works, because the politics and the hierarchy of the Necrons can be quite confusing. I think as a written piece it's explained better in the text in the 10th edition Codex, but if you just want an at-a-glance view of how it all works for a new player, it might be a bit abstract. An interesting extra detail that we seem to get here is the explanation of the different noble names in Necron society. A lot of the higher noble roles have quite simple names: Pharaon, Overlord, Vizier, Nemesaur, but it details how the further down the tree you go, often the names get more complex and elongated, and this is usually because those names are created just as a throwaway, given to lesser nobles just to show that they did something or that they've been loyal, but the name itself doesn't really mean anything. And then these names complexify even more when dynasties merge or old pharaons die and are replaced by a new one and they choose to change the whole system, and it gives quite a comedic detail to the ridiculousness of all the long noble names that play effect in some of the dynasties. As a reprieve from some of the rather dense paragraphs of lore that we're getting over and over again, we get a lovely piece of art here. I love this art. I think it really well shows the warring between dynasties, the great machines that they bring to bear against each other, how petty they can be fighting amongst each other when ultimately they're the same, which you could argue applies to a lot of 40k overall. It has a lot of character to the artwork, the engraved noble armor pieces that the Necrons are wearing in the art, and the weapons that they're holding up to each other. It's not just the silver tide, implacable advance walking forward on another race, it's more regal figures. Clearly they've got beef with each other, and I don't know, it's very expressive to me. And following that we get a great little story about Anrakit the Traveller, who is a great character, probably one of my favourites. It's not a very long story, but I think it does great effect in showing the cool, calm, collected nature of Anrakir, sort of walking into this tomb complex to face this court of hoity-toity overlords and cryptex and regents who aren't particularly welcoming to Anrakir coming in and making a request, and he sort of displays his power in return, and how ultimately all these Necron traditions and formalities don't matter for shit when you've got the upper hand on an opponent. After this we get back into the meat and potatoes, I suppose, of the Necron. It details some of the major dynasties, some of the major characters. Again, copy-paste from the last codex. It's not offering a lot of extra here. Maybe you get an extra paragraph. I think in the case of the characters, you're actually getting less. In the 9th edition codex, you were getting a page each on Anrakir, Xandrek and Oberon, Trazyn the Infinite, Illuminor Zeraz, Oric the Diviner, and of course Imitek and Zerak. In the 10th edition codex, you're getting a couple of paragraphs on Xandrek and Oberon, Trazyn the Infinite, 3 short paragraphs, and then it's on to the big boys. I wouldn't really have a problem with this if it was something fresh, even a different wording, but again, it's copy-paste from previously. We do get a very interesting feature piece on 2 pages in the middle of the Codex lore section, which essentially details the Silent King's voyage, how after the Great Transference and sending his people into sleep, he ventured out into the fringes of the galaxy, and I think it alludes that he built something out there. He built something for his people to inherit, to be gifted at the end of all mantles, which is very interesting. I think that could allude that while he was on the fringes of the galaxy, while he saw the Tyranids advancing towards the 40k galaxy, I think maybe he was building maybe a new Necron tomb world out there, some sort of new area for the Necrons to go to, maybe after a greater goal has been achieved. It also has some great artwork that shows possibly what the Necron tier looked like before biotransference, which is the first time we're seeing this in any Necron lore, and I think they've done good justice here. great short paragraphs which are written in a very distinct style, showing how the Silent King has done so much for the Necrons and doesn't really expect anything from it. It doesn't expect any great praise or anything, but if the Necron dynasties knew of all that he had done, they would probably be a bit more grateful. And I think that's true. Personally, Silent King enjoyer on this side, I think the Silent King is probably the most selfless of Necrons. He sees the bigger picture of the galaxy, the threat of the Tyranids. He is more diplomatic, he is more likely to work with more 40k factions, I feel like. And there are some really interesting characters that play into the Silent King story, Zerikan's story, like Andrakith Traveller, Orikan the Diviner, Illuminor Zeraz, and countless other characters.
Commencing interpretive broadcast of Interrogative Record XLI-NA3. Archivistic analysis indicates record salvaged from Site 67Y. Look into records pending.
The lore chapters of this codex conclude with a short story from Sudyev Dekaith, rogue trader and captain of a ship called Emergent Concord. This short story sort of reminds me of, you know in Lord of the Rings when Saruman says to Gandalf, "The dwarves delved too greedily and too deep. You know what they awoke in the darkness of the mines." It's a similar situation here. The rogue traders are looking for artifacts and precious things that they can sell on. They stumbled across some mysterious blackstone tombs, they didn't know what they were looking at, they prodded a bit too deep, and the tomb world prodded back. Mountains erupt into rubble and collapsing cities, pylons being brought to the surface, legions of Necrons stomp their way out of their stasis. It really is terrifying to think from an Imperium perspective. Another world, seemingly nothing to be too worried about, and they awaken one of the most fearsome races in the galaxy. It's an interesting little short story, and it's a fun perspective to see things from the other side, you know, how utterly terrifying the Necron can be, not thinking of things from the perspective of your faction, but thinking of them as another terrifying Xenos that the Imperium is not even slightly prepared to deal with. This concludes the lore section of the book. I hope it's given you a decent impression of what it contains. You've got 3 short stories about 2 pages long that, as far as I can tell, are unique to this codex. And you've got a ton of information about the Necron as a faction, a lot of which is reused from previous codices, but I still think has a lot of value if you've not read it all or if you're new to Necrons. I want to be critical of this because I think it is important that we're getting new content, value for our money, but at the same time, when the main reason that we're buying these codexes is for the rules, I think it would be unfair to act as if the reason we're buying these is for the lore of the books. I think there's a good balance. A lot of people are worried that one day the codexes won't have any lore or new stuff in whatsoever, and I can definitely say that we're not there yet. This codex is 136 pages, whereas the last codex was 120, and you're getting more lore and stuff other than rules and data sheets in this book than the last one. Now that we've moved out of the lore section and into sort of more the model/gameplay side of the book, there's a few pages on showcasing some of the miniatures painted by Games Workshop, so showing you some of the different colour schemes that you can paint your models up, and generally some pretty pictures of the miniatures. It's a bit of a sales pitch, but it's nice to see some glamour shots. After this comes a whole chapter on Combat Patrol. It's entitled Amnatek's Guard. Giving it a slight narrative twist, it details all of the models that are included in the Combat Patrol and provides data sheets for the slightly watered down versions of the units that you would use to play Combat Patrol. It is nice that this is included in the Codex. Combat Patrol is meant to be the very entry level for a faction. You can buy everything you need in one box, and if the rules are included here in the Codex, then you can play it straight away with one Combat Patrol box and the Codex. Really expecting people to invest in a full 2,000 point army before they play the game, or even 1,000 points, is a lot to expect, whereas if people can pick up one box and the Codex and play the game straight away, it removes a huge barrier to entry, and I think it's quite a positive thing. Also, something that's in this codex that I haven't seen in a previous codex is a quick painting guide on how to paint up your models. It's nothing groundbreaking, there's no Citadel masterclass tips in here, but it gives a quick breakdown of the paints that you'll need, and then a step-by-step of how to achieve some basic effects, like glowing blades, dry brushing bases, that sort of thing. It's a useful thing to have in the Codex, again, because this is meant to be a one-stop shop for getting your army on the table, and having something like this included is going to remove those barriers for people that maybe buy it without knowing how to paint the models that they've bought with it. So, speaking of playing with thousands of points, let's get into the full army rules for Necrons in 10th edition. These are effectively broken up into 4 subsections. We've got the detachment rules, enhancements for each detachment, and stratagems for each detachment. And then our Necron units. If you don't know what a detachment is, it's basically the word in 10th edition for the different play style that you're going for with your army. You pick one detachment for a game, and that's the rules that you play by. This is combined with your army rule, which hasn't changed since before this codex came out. If you've kept up with late news, you may have heard about reanimation being nerfed heavily for Necrons, but the core army rule, reanimation protocols, actually hasn't changed at all. All that's changed is other rules in the stratagems, enhancements, and units, which has affected how effective the reanimation protocols army rule is. So you get reanimation protocols regardless of what detachment you take. We always reanimate it. If you're coming from 9th edition, this rule may seem familiar. Effectively, they rolled living metal rules on units and the reanimation protocols rules into one. You're reanimating wounds lost off of models and bringing them back if a model is dead. Personally, I really like how this rule is done. I think it may get tweaks in the near future, but it was certainly too strong starting out in 10th edition, so I think some of the nerfs were fair. I'll go through and give a quick summary of each of the 5 detachments that we have available to us. Firstly, the Awakened Dynasty that we're familiar with. The rule still being that while a Necron's character is leading a unit, that unit gets +1 to its hit roll. This is nice and dependable, it's quite an easy rule to wrap your head around, it's a good starting point for Necrons. I think it was a good choice to start with this in 10th edition. It gives a nice solid buff to a lot of your units you're going to be depending upon. Immortals, Necron Warriors, Lichguard and Scorpek works both for hitting on ranged attacks and melee attacks, so it's not specialised, it's nice and varied. I think this detachment has received some of the heavier nerfs because it's been around longer, they've got a better idea what to bring down. In the enhancements, previously we had the Sovereign Coronal, which was an aura. This has been renamed to the Phasal Subjugator, which no longer has the ability to give leader shenanigans to any units, instead it just gives a flat +1 to the hit roll. This is unfortunate, I felt like it was quite a creative enhancement to have. If you could figure out how to finagle it into a unit to cleverly give buffs to a vehicle or something, that was quite nice. It wasn't overpowered, it was just something that you had to spec into, and that's been taken away. The Hypermaterial Ablator has now been renamed the Netherrealm Casket, and you no longer get the benefit of cover if you're inside 12, it only gives you stealth, which is fair enough. It was quite strong before, they were all strong before. Now I feel like Veil of Darkness and Sempiternal Weave are probably stronger for their points. And the stratagems as well, I feel like they took quite a heavy hit. Protocol of the Hungry Void is no longer stacking. Protocol of the Conquering Tyrant no longer gets rerolls to wound, instead it's just rerolls to hit, which for 1 CP they're already quite readily available in the Necron Codex, but it could have its place. And Protocol of the Vengeful Stars has now been nerfed, and it also costs 2 CP, so that's probably never going to get used anymore by anyone. Being able to shoot back is nice, but not at those costs when it's such a situation dependent thing. It's something you might pull out of the bag once in a series of games. Overall, I still like this detachment. I feel like it is the median for the Necron Codex. It's not super interesting or flashy, but it's nice, you know. It's like Zerrikan Dynasty in 9th edition, having rerolls to reanimate. It's an easy entry point, and I think that is important in a codex that can be so packed with rules it can be quite confusing. And from there we go into the second detachment, Annihilation Legion. The rule of this detachment is that each time a Destroyer Cult or Flayed Ones unit from your army declares a charge, you can re-roll the charge roll. If one or more units of that charge are below half strength, add 1 to the charge as well. Now, I'm not the only one that thinks that this is quite a weak basis for a detachment, because it's only specific to Destroyer Cult units and Flayed One units. That limits very much what you're going to be playing effectively. Unless you have a lot of those units in your army that you want to run, you're not going to be going anywhere near this. Then not to mention that the enhancements aren't too terrific either. Only one of them really allows you to hit a bit harder with your melee, and even then it's quite specialized. Same with the stratagems really. really. I think if they want a Novox style hit harder Necron detachment, it really needs to be not specific at all. It needs to be broad. It needs to apply to basically everything melee in your army, even just hitting with fists on your ranged units when they get into melee combat. Adding AP maybe to more units, because otherwise if Necrons get into melee with a lot of melee heavy armies, they're just going to get absolutely shredded. And while having bonuses to charge is nice, we're going to get to a detachment later that allows you to get much closer to your opponents and gives you more positioning around the board, which if you're running melee, that's much more what you want. So this detachment is a bit flat. It hasn't really got a place when you've already got other detachments more specialized for what you would want as a melee army. And boy, do we move on to a strong one, the Canoptic Court. This detachment rule may seem a bit daunting at first, but it's not all that complex. Essentially, when you set up the battlefield, there are certain areas that are marked out. The enemy's deployment zone, your deployment zone, and this rule makes it so that some of those zones can be within your power matrix. Your deployment zone is always within your power matrix. At the start of any phase, if you control at least half of the objective markers within No Man's Land, which is usually the middle of the board, until the end of that phase, No Man's Land is within your army's power matrix. At the start of any phase, if you control at least half of the objective markers within the opponent's deployment zone until the end of that phase, your opponent's deployment zone is within your army's power matrix. And when you're in a power matrix, each time a model in a Cryptek or Canoptic unit from your army makes an attack, re-roll a hit roll of 1, and if such a unit is wholly within the army's power matrix, you can re-roll the hit instead. Now this is what I'm talking about in terms of Necrons getting an easy way to re-roll hits. We have some decent keywords on a lot of other units, and giving the ability for entire units across the board to be getting reroll ones or reroll hits entirely is incredibly powerful. This can be quite a dominant detachment if you're thinking ahead, you're thinking cleverly about where you're placing your units. It's probably a high skill ceiling detachment. You're getting some of those bonuses right from the beginning with your deployment zone. You could put some bigger units like the Canoptic Doomstalker in the back there, and it's always going to be getting rerolling its hits. And then if you perform well enough and think well enough ahead and get lucky with those dice rolls, you're going to be getting the upper hand on your opponent on objectives in their deployment zone. It's incredibly strong. The enhancements are also very good. Maybe too good. In a recent 40k tournament, Canoptic Court did very well. There were a couple of players that went away with crushing victories over their opponent. They won every game. And it's not surprising, a high level player can do quite a lot with this detachment. It wouldn't surprise me if we do see nerfs in the future, but as a basis, it's a very solid rule to build a detachment on. So we've got the Dimensional Sanctum Cryptek models. In this unit have the Infiltrator's ability that allows you to get so far up the board so early. That's incredibly strong. Hyperphasic Fulcrum, Cryptek model only, while the bearer leading this unit is wholly within your army's power matrix. Each time a model in that unit makes an attack, reroll a wound of 1. So you're getting rerolling hits and rerolling a wound roll of 1, increasing your effectiveness, very strong. Auto Divinator, Cryptek model, each time your opponent gains CP as the result of an ability, roll a d6, and on a 2+ you gain a CP, giving you more CP to work with, more stratagems to work with, more availability for you to get clever with your rule use. Very strong. And lastly, Metallodermal Tessel Weed. The Necrons enhancements have the absolute best names. I love imagining the gizmos and gadgets that they have at their disposal. Cryptek model only, once per phase, when an enemy unit selects the bearer's unit as a target of charge, roll a d6 on a 2 to 5, mortal wounds, on a 6, more mortal wounds. Pretty solid. As you can tell with the use of the Cryptek keyword, they very heavily want you to use Cryptek models in your army and attach them to units. That's not a bad thing. I think they're quite good in this edition. None of them are dog shit. In 9th edition, there were a couple of duds in there which you weren't really taking very often. The other two were just so much better. In this edition, I think they are much more even, although some of them are a bit stronger, as we'll get to in units. You're going to be taking Crypteks anyway, so why not use this detachment and buff them up, and then from that point buff your units up as well, because when a Cryptek is attached to a unit, that unit also gets the Cryptek keyword. Stratagems, we've got some great stratagems. I love this Curse of the Cryptek. Your opponent's shooting phase or fight phase after they've just shot or fought, so that could be basically in the middle of an enemy fight phase. As soon as they've done something in the fight phase, you can select your Cryptek model which has been destroyed and curse the enemy unit that destroyed it, so that when any Canoptic model attacks that unit in the future, future, you get +1 to the hit and +1 to the wound. That's hilarious. You've got very functional stratagems here as well. The suboptimal facade. Your opponent's charge phase, after they've declared a charge, you can select a canoptic unit that is wholly within your army's power matrix, and you get your reanimation protocols. Obviously it has to be within your army's power matrix, but that's incredibly effective, giving you more ways to use your army rule to make your detachment rule better. Penultimately, we have the obeisance phalanx. The detachment rule for this one is that in your command phase, select one enemy unit until the start of your next command phase. Each time an Overlord, Lich Guard or Triarch unit from that army makes an attack that targets that unit, add 1 to the wound roll. This is basically Oaths of Moments for Necrons. I don't mind it too much. It's more rerolls. It's not a very interesting rule. However, it is quite a fluffy rule from my perspective. I like rules that focus on the Necrons' hierarchy of power, and that's very much what this detachment is. You're taking your Overlords, and it also gives some buffs to Lich Guard and Triarch units, which I feel are now a little bit weaker than they used to be, which is nice. The enhancements aren't bad, the stratagems aren't bad. I feel like this has a nice place. Again, it's not standout, but it's nice. If you like taking lots of Overlords and characters, then I think this detachment could be for you. Just remember that it's not about having the best detachment, it's about having the detachment that you enjoy playing, that you think is fun. None of the stratagems are 2 CP, they're all 1 CP. Would also be a good match for the new Imitek the Stormlord model, getting that bonus CP, having even more stratagems to play with and use. And finally, I'm going to move on to the Hypercrypt Legion. This was the first detachment that we got a sneak peek of before the full Codex came out. And a lot of people summed it up by just saying, oh, it's just the Grey Knights army rule reused and tweaked. And I agree, I was a bit disappointed, but I think placed in this Codex, it has a really good position, essentially hyper movement on Necrons. It works from a fluffy perspective. They're so technologically advanced, they're going to be appearing wherever they want to, and you're going to really struggle to deal with them. And it works from a gameplay perspective in that objective control and movement and placement is so important in 40k that this gives you incredible amount of power on the tabletop. But I'm getting carried away. The detachment rule. At the end of your opponent's turn, you can select a number of Necron units from your army. The maximum number of units you can select depends on the battle size: 2 for incursion, 3 for strike force, 4 for onslaught. Once you have made your selection, remove those units from the battlefield and place them into strategic reserves. Effectively what this means is that at the end of your opponent's turn, you're picking up to 3 units if you're playing 2,000 points and just taking them off the board. And then at the start of your next turn, you're then putting them back on the table. The enhancements are all available to put on Necrons models. This is good. That's the most common keyword in the Codex for units. It means you've got a lot more availability where to put these enhancements. And the first, especially of the enhancements, is just straight away a buff to hyperphasing. I can't imagine if you wouldn't be taking this for your army. It's an auto take. Dimensional Overseer, Necrons model only while the bearer is on the battlefield or in strategic reserves. Add 1 to the number of units in your army that you can select for the hyperphasing rule. So if you have that on a model and it's not dead, you're immediately taking 4 units to put into strategic reserves instead of 3. Solid. You're never not taking that, ever. The Osteoclave Fulcrum, Necrons model only. Models in the bearer's unit have the deep strike ability. Again, put that on a unit. It's got deep strike. You can put it wherever you want on the board when you're pulling it in from strategic reserves, which you're always going to have a model in strategic reserves with this army. So the enhancements might not be incredibly interesting, but they are straight away solid buffs to hyperphasing. You're always going to be using them with your army rule. Then in the stratagems, one that especially caught my eye, Reanimation Crypts. Your command phase, select a Necron's Warlord. For each of your Necrons units that you have in reserves, reanimation protocols activate.
In the turn order, effectively, what this means is that at the end of your opponent's turn, you'll take the models that you want to put in reserves off the board. Then in your command phase, you can use this stratagem for 1 CP to use reanimation protocols on those units in reserve, as normally the reanimation protocol stratagem requires the units to be on the board. Then next in your movement phase, you can put the units back on the board from reserves in whatever order you want to.
So that's just a brief summary of detachments in this book. I think quite solid. There's only one that's obviously a steaming pile. The rest I think have a nice place. Some stronger than others obviously, but that's okay. It's not always about being the best. It's having a nice varied range of playstyles that you can choose from as a Necrons player. You don't want to be playing your army and getting bored of it after a couple of weeks. You want more playstyles to dip into, different combinations to play with. I think a lot of these play very well with the unit choices that you have. Obviously there's a bit of a lean. Hypercrypt Legion, you're probably going to be wanting to take Catan,
And monoliths.
melee units to get up in your enemy's face, dropping units in with deep strike. That's the detachment, by the way, I was talking about earlier. If you want to take melee, you probably want to take Hypercrypt because it's just much better. For obeisance phalanx, you're probably going to be wanting to take lots of Overlords, Silent Kings, stuff like that. Canoptek Core, obviously Cryptek models, Canoptek units. Annihilation Legion, if you're mad, you're going to be wanting to take Destroyer Cult and Flayed Ones. But if you're consciously choosing to play Annihilation Legion with 5 units of Flayed Ones, I honestly respect you a great deal. Good for you, playing what you want and saying fuck it. I hope you win. And Awakened Dynasty, which I have a soft spot for, just because it's nice to hit on 2s. Anyway, I shall move on because this video is getting quite long. We're going to move on to the Necron units. And I'll quickly highlight some changes that have been made, some glow-ups that some units have had, and some nerfs that others have received. This is all subject to change, units change a lot, and every unit is going to be dependent on its points, what it costs to put it in your army. A unit could have the best rules in the game, but if it costs 500 points, you're probably not going to take it. So we've got some of the new models that Games Workshop has come out with recently. I think these were a good way of generating some hype for the new Necrons Codex. Everyone loves a new model. We've had an amazing year of models, and it was lovely to get some new Necron models at the end of a good year. Imitek the Stormlord got a new model. It's not as flashy as the Silent King, but it shouldn't be. The Silent King is the Silent King. Imitek is a terrifying monarch, but he does not come with the regal aura that the Silent King does. Zerrikan gang gang. However, Imitek's rules are quite spicy. Grand Strategist, at the start of your command phase, if this model is on the battlefield, you gain 1 CP. For those that don't know, in 10th edition, at the start of your command phase, every army generates 1 CP. So this effectively doubles the amount of CP per turn you're generating to play with. That doubles the amount of stratagems you have to use, and gives you some fun CP to have in the bank if you want those last second CP rerolls for that 1 dice that you need to make, stuff like that you would usually be saving for the right stratagem. Maybe you don't have to be as cautious with it anymore, you can just roll those dice. Personally, I quite like his new model. I think I prefer the old head that he had. It was a bit more menacing, but I think the rest is better. Illuminor Zeraz, who I'm a personal fan of, I've got his model, it's one of my favourite models. He's had a glow up in 10th edition, and he's had even a bit of buff here. A lot of units have gone from 7-inch movement, which they had at the end of 9th edition, because one of the detachments allowed them to get +1 inch to move. A lot of units have gone up to 8-inch move. So if you see 8-inch move in this codex, then it was probably 7 inches before, so it's nice that they're getting that extra movement. Zera's got a little bit of a nerf in his mechanical augmentation aura. It's gone from a default of 6 inches to 3 inches, and his atomic energy manipulator, which enhances that mechanical augmentation to a max of 12 inches now. It can't keep stacking and stacking and stacking every turn, although you were probably only getting it to 12 inches anyway, but now it's capped. He's an incredibly hench model. He's got 9 wounds, toughness 8, he has a feel no pain 4+. You can't attach anything to him, you can't give him crypto thralls, but if he is within 3 inches of another friendly Necrons unit, then he does get lone operative, which increases his tankiness even more. He's hard to get to, he's hard to kill, so you really have a chance to get those buffs that he's putting out onto other units without him dying. Then there's Trazen the Infinite, who still hasn't had a model refresh, and his rules are still absolute garbage, and I'm quite upset about it. Come on, man, give us a Black Library release. Give my boy a short story, release his model. We can have Orican and Trazen together on the tabletop. Come on, think about it. Speaking of Orican, he's got a flashy new model as well. He has excellent rules this edition, which has probably helped him get a new flashy model. Once per battle at the start of a fight phase, he can go into his monkey mode. You triple the attacks and strength of his Staff of Tomorrow, and every successful wound roll is a critical wound. So not only is he probably going to be with a beefy unit, he's now the only Cryptek that can actually lead Lichguard and give them a 4-up invulnerable save without their shield. But if you get him into melee, he's absolutely going to bonk. I really like the new model, I have it, I hope to be painting it up soon on this channel. I'm just trying to decide if I want to keep him as Orican or kit bash him to absolute shit, but it is a gorgeous model by itself, and he's very strong. Then there's a new Overlord with Translocation Shroud. I don't think we needed another Overlord, and I think the model looks a bit silly. It's flashy, it's interesting, but I think the Necron underneath all the flashy translocation bits looks a bit plain. I think we could have had something a bit more interesting. But his rules are interesting. He provides a nice middle ground between the overlords. He has a resurrection orb available to him. He also has My Will Be Done like the regular overlord, but then he has Translocation Shroud. This effectively gives an auto advance 6, and every time that unit makes a normal move, advances or falls back, until the move is finished, it can move horizontally through models and terrain. Basically has fly, but only for making a normal move, advance or fall back. And that's all of the new models that we've had released recently. Moving on from there, we've got the classics from Indomitus, the Overlord. I love this model. I love that there are different variations of this model. Now that the old school Lord has been removed, this is basically your stock Overlord that you want. He has good war gear. I just wish that his Tachyon arrow had devastating wounds or something. Something to make one shot worth it. D6+2 is better than it used to be though. The Skorpek Lord, another amazing Indomitus model, has recently gone down points. I'm not sure if it justifies his cost yet, but he's more interesting than he used to be. Again, he got that movement increase. I think his Flensing Claw should have extra attacks. It's not like it would break his model, as his Mythic Annihilator doesn't have pistol, so you're not going to be using that in engagement range. He does have the ability to do some mortal wounds, and of course you can attack him to Skorpek Destroyers, making that unit a bit tougher, which Skorpek Destroyers need a bit really because of what they're competing with now, but we'll get onto that in a minute. The Locust Lord, again up to 8-inch move. Another model that could really do with a refresh, but also another model that I have personally kit bashed myself and look forward to painting up on the channel, so like and subscribe if you want to see that in the near future. Unfortunately, the only models that this unit can lead are the Locust Destroyers and the Locust Heavy Destroyers. It does have some decent buffs for those units, but I feel like you're not really going to be taking the cost of a Locust Lord to put with units that are going to sit in the backfield and snipe at enemies. Then we have one of the absolute cheapest character units in this codex, the Royal Warden. Now that they've changed his adaptive strategy ability back to how it used to be in 9th edition, I think this guy might be an auto-include if you have any Immortals or Necron Warriors in your army list. The adaptive strategy ability now gives the unit the eligibility to shoot and declare a charge in a turn in which it fell back. This means that if you've got some melee unit that's charged into your Necron Warriors, for example, the Necron Warriors are not going to be doing great in melee. The Royal Warden is going to allow them to fall back and then in their shooting phase shoot into those charging attacking units, giving them the potential to do some extra damage before they're killed if they're killed. Onto the Cryptex, and here's where we've had quite a large change in this codex. The Technomancer, Psychomancer, Plasmancer, and Chronomancer. None of these models can lead Lichguard anymore. This is largely to do with the Technomancer, which used to be able to put the Rites of Reanimation ability onto a squad of Lichguard, who would already have a 4-up invulnerable save from their shields, and then giving them a 5-up Feel No Pain from the Technomancer as well. This was just too much, given that the Technomancer could also regen wounds on that unit. It made them too tanky, so Games Workshop said, no, we don't want that anymore on Lichguard. So now, no Cryptex can go with Lichguard anymore. But what's this? The Technomancer can go with Canoptic Wraiths? Let's have a quick look at those Canoptic Wraiths, shall we? 10-inch move, toughness 6, 4 wounds with a 4-up invulnerable save, 2 OC. Not amazing shooting and not amazing melee, but not bad by any means. 4 attacks at 4+, depending on your detachment rule. Strength 6, AP 1, damage 2. You can take those in a unit of 3 or a unit of 6 with a Technomancer attached. And you can do mortal wounds with the Wraith Form ability charging over enemy units. That is absolutely hench. And that combination, the Technomancer and the Canoptic Wraiths, is exactly what has been winning people games recently in Warhammer 40k tournaments, with the Canoptic Court detachment. So GW takes with one hand and giveth with the other. Personally, I think it's a massive oversight. I think Canoptic Wraiths are going to get nerfed, and then we're going to be left with nerfed Lichguard and nerfed Wraiths. I don't know why they added Wraiths able to be paired with the Technomancer when there are other options available. It could have been Spiders or Canoptic Scarab Swarms. The Wraiths function the same, if not better, as Lichguard, but the Lichguard are a more core unit of the Necron Codex. Why nerf a core unit of the Necron Codex like that when you could change something else that wouldn't just remove their strength? I do think the Lichguard were too strong before, but I don't think this was the way to resolve it. Anyway, back to the Cryptex. So I think we've covered the Technomancer there. The Psychomancer is improved. It's quite revolving around Battle Shock, but that's a nice thing to have. In 10th edition, when Battle Shock is there, it's a mechanic. It might get changed in the future to be more impactful. It's nice to have that unit actually able to do something instead of in 9th edition where it didn't work. The unit did not work. Plasmancer remains old, reliable, mortal wounds. The Harbinger of Destruction ability, which gives you critical hits of a 5+, is very good on Immortals with Tesla. Again, something which might see a bit of a nerf bonk in the future, but until then, it's spicy, it's nice to use. And the Chronomancer is, I think, a solid Cryptek all round. Allows you to shoot and fade, you can make up to a 5-inch normal move after you've shot. The Catan Shards. I believe these are the last models I'm going to be saying this about in the unit section, but god, I want these models to be refreshed. Please, James Workshop, I challenge anyone to go away and read The Infinite and the Divine, and then come back and look at the Catan Shard of the Deceiver and say, yeah, it looks alright, there's no problem with that. I think I could make a better model out of green stuff, and I don't mean to shit on the person that made the model initially. It's a very old model, but it doesn't hold up when you've got the absolute Chad Catan Shard of the Void Dragon standing across the table for it, looking absolutely resplendent. We need a new Nightbringer, we need a new Deceiver to fully flesh out the Catan in all their majesty. They're an awesome aspect of the Necron army. They stand so tall but have such a low position. They have so much clout in the Necron lore. They deserve better. However, rules wise, they are stonks. The Nightbringer has absolutely insane damage. If you're getting into fighting range, or even if you're getting within 18 range with the Gaze of Death, you're doing d6 plus 3, d6 plus 2, devastating wounds. Drain life at the end of the fight phase, roll 1d6 for each enemy unit within 6. On a 4+, that model suffers d3 wounds, and it has the Necrodermis ability, which all of the Catan have, which is halving the damage characteristic of damage taken to that model. With a 4-up invulnerable and 12 wounds, that makes all of the Catan Shards very tanky and very sustainable in combat. Especially the Void Dragon, who is going to be healing on damage dealt to vehicles. He has very varied attacks, ranged weapons, melee weapons with extra attacks with his Canoptic Tail. They are strong. And then to tack onto that, we have the Tesseract Vault, which I'm going to include with the Catan because it is still using the powers of the Catan. The Tesseract Vault, 24 wounds, toughness 12, 4-up invul, and you can choose 2 powers of the Catan now. This could be a very viable Titanic towering model to use with the Necrons. Moving on from the Catan into the battle line units, the meat and potatoes of your army. Good old Necron warriors. They're not as good as they used to be, unfortunately. I think the days of the Silver Tide competitively are over, but everyone's got Necron warriors, and they're fun. Especially if you're pairing them with something like a monolith, deploying them in the middle of the battlefield. They have good weapons, good OC. They don't reanimate as much as they used to. You're only re-rolling the dice now for how many wounds are reanimated. But still, I think maybe a tiny points drop and Necron warriors could be viable again. Immortals, on the other hand, amazing for their points at the moment. They're still only 1 wound, but they're 5-inch move, toughness 5, 3-up save. Tesla Carbine's got a great buff up to 24-inch range, which is the same as Gorse Blaster, and given that they have sustained hits, that means that on average you're going to be getting better value for your dice. Then with their Implacable Eradication ability, each time a model in this unit makes an attack, reroll a roll of 1, and if the target is within range of an objective marker, you're rerolling full wounds. So using this rule in coordination with Tesla Carbine's 24-inch range sustained hits 2, and then maybe you have a Plasmancer in the mix as well, so you're getting that on 5+, you could do some great damage to enemies sitting on an objective, clearing them off and then advancing onto it and holding it. The Hexmark Destroyer got a slight change so that it wasn't as jank as before. It was one of those units that came out in 10th edition and the rule wasn't completely thought through. It was cool, but it wasn't completely thought through, so that there was a bit of an issue with a Hexmark Destroyer effectively infinitely shooting. That's been tweaked now, so it's not happening, but they're still getting Overwatch on 2s for free, and they have a decent profile. I think they're good value, but they're a great little unit. I love imagining them just flailing around on the battlefield, shooting in all directions. It brings joy to my heart. Lichguard, oh Lichguard. Oh, you poor boys. Not as strong as they once were without the support of Cryptex, but still just absolutely iconic units. I think Necrons and I think Lichguard straight away in my mind. They're probably some of the most important units in the Necron world. I don't know what buff you could give them. I think maybe Hyperphase Sword being 2 damage and War Scythes being 3, but then they have devastating wounds. It might be a bit too strong. The best way to run them at the moment is probably still with Dispersion Shield, Hyperphase Sword, maybe run them in blocks of 10. They're still good value, they're still cheap units, it's just that they're outshone at the moment by Wraiths in every single way. But I will still be running them because I love them. Triarch Praetorians, it has some ranged attacks as well as melee attacks, and they have fly. They also have deep strike, I suppose, so they might have some sort of synergy with Hypercrypt Legion, or even the Obeisance Phalanx, getting the buffs that Triarchs get. Death Marks are still serving their given purpose. I think Games Workshop have pretty much decided what they want Death Marks to do in this edition. I can't see that changing very much. I love that they're 2 damage now, and they have precision, so you can maybe use it to snipe off some weak characters. I think if any character is full health, you're going to be hard pressed to destroy them, unless maybe it's a unit of 10 and you get some good rolls. One thing that is interesting though that I didn't realise at first is that they have heavies, so if they're not moving, they're hitting on 2s instead of 3s. And using the plunging fire rule in 10th edition, if the unit is 6 inches or more vertically from the ground, and every model in the target unit is at ground level, then you're getting an extra 1 to your AP. Now they're still only strength 5, but AP 3 2 damage is not bad if you plonk a unit of 5 of these up in a tower and just use them in a really irritating manner to pick off units here and there, anything that's left out of cover or that you can snipe at. It makes these models feel like snipers, which is what they're meant to be. Crypto Thralls also saw quite a hard nerf. Previously they had a 4-up feel no pain and 2 wounds. People were using this by including them in a unit with a Cryptech, maybe a unit of 10 warriors, and then putting the Crypto Thralls at the front of the unit so that they were blocking the shots. They were then negating these wounds with the 4-up feel no pain, and then using reanimation protocols to bring the Crypto Thralls back over and over again, and that combination was too strong and had to be taken out. So now, unfortunately, they're the same points, they're only giving the 4-up feel no pain to the Cryptech, but they did gain 1 wound. I don't think that that's a good balance. I think they are overcosted now for what they do, but if they saw a points reduction, I would love to see them included. I love the idea of Crypto Thralls. As I mentioned earlier in the video, they have fun lore, they're interesting, they look cool, they're sort of the halfway point between warriors and flayed ones and canoptic units. And on death they get a nice little fight on death on a 2-up, which is nice. Tomb Blades got a decent adjustment. They now have a 12-inch move, unless you're taking Shield Veins, which changes the save characteristic to a 3+, and your move characteristic goes down to 8 inches. You can now take the extra tankiness a little bit but be slower. You still have Nebula Scope, which gives you ignores cover, and Shadow Loom that gives you stealth, and Evasion Engrams lets you make a normal move of up to 6 after shooting, which is great. You can fire and fade, move out of cover, shoot, pop back inside cover, so you have some decent evasion, which I think is much better than the old rule. It's just a question of whether you want that 3-up save or that 12-inch move. I'm going to group some units together now for the sake of time, and just pick out some slight highlights. Destroyers I feel aren't a terrible unit, their points have come down recently, but they need a bit more punch. They need something that when they do get in range, they're really hitting without the help of a character buffing them up. Something to stand on their own 3 legs? No legs? Tails? Who knows? Still have the ability to buff up Scorpec Destroyers and Ophidian Destroyers with the Plasma Sight. If I'm reading the rule right, you can take as many Plasma Sights as you want in the unit, and each time you're using the Plasma Sight, you're taking 1 off. So I suppose if you had 2 units of 3 Scorpecs, you would get 1 Plasma Sight in each box, and then you could have 6 Scorpecs with 2 Plasma Sights, 2 uses of the buff. But I don't see anything here that says that you couldn't buy a bunch of Plasma Sights on eBay and attach 5 to 3 Scorpecs. Although they wouldn't survive that long because they're not tanky enough. The Locust Heavy Destroyer in Mythic Exterminator, which is an awesome looking bit. I love that gun, it looks so meaty. Now got Rapid Fire 6 and Sustained Hits 1. That means that if you're within 18 inches, you're getting a lot more attacks. It's still heavy, so you're either hitting on BS2 or BS3. A lot of attacks with Sustained Hits. I don't think we need the extra shots, but it is an interesting purpose to give the Mythic Exterminator, rather than everyone just auto-taking the Gorse Destructor, which also has lethal hit. The Canoptic Reanimator got its aura nerfed down to 3 inches. Again, more nerfs to reanimation protocols overall, we're not just getting everyone back up again, but I still think that the Reanimator holds a good purpose. It's just trying to keep it safe so that your enemy doesn't blast it off the board. Although 6 wounds with a 4-up Feel No Pain isn't too bad, it's just that it's going to get targeted, and there are plenty of things in 40k that can shoot a Canoptic unit off the board in 1 turn of shooting. shooting. Everyone sleeps on the spiders. I think spiders have a good spot, especially now with the Canoptic Court. They probably have even more usability. They have some good buffs, especially anti-Psyker with the Gloom Prism. And they look cool. Little spider boys. Love them. Already talked about Canoptic Wraiths. I refuse to elaborate. The Doomsday Arc Cannon went up to strength 18, which is absolutely ridiculous. AP 4, damage 4. The Doomsday Arc is solid now. It's still more solid than the Canoptic Doomstalker at strength 14, AP 3, damage 3. But he's got the bigger dong. He's shooting with the bigger stick. Again, the Canoptic Doomstalker has those benefits the same as the spiders that I mentioned. It can be used in the Canoptic Court detachment. The Doomsday Arc, you could use it, but you're getting the benefits of Canoptic, so it makes more sense. It's also cheaper. But the Doomsday Arc by itself, as it is one of the most prolific vehicle units in the Necron army, I think it's still very solid. Less so for the Ghost Arc now, given that reanimation protocols are less prominent. Controversially, I also think that the Doom Scythe is quite viable. Reading through the abilities, I think it has great damage potential. The buffs to Tesla, sustained hits 2 with Twin Linked, and the ability Atavistic Instigation. You're basically forcing your enemy to stand firm and take crits on a 5+, or they duck for cover and they subtract 1 from their hit roll for the next turn. That is a massive middle finger to give your opponent from just flying a bird over them. The Obelisk is still a levitating turd. I talked a little bit about the Tesseract Vault earlier. I think that and the Monolith give some great massive vehicle potential to the Necron army. There's only so many models that we have that have the effectiveness of massive tanks or Baneblades or Titans or something moving across the battlefield. The Monolith has excellent shooting and excellent melee, and it has some good abilities as well in the Eternity Gate. If you pair this with the right detachment, I think the Monolith especially could be very effective. It's thick. Boy, it's 22 wounds, 2 up save, and you might be able to, in one of the detachments, I believe there's a rule to give a vehicle a 4 up feel no pain. A real centerpiece for your army, I think, has given value back to the Monolith again on the tabletop. And that's your bunch for units. From there it goes into Crusade rules. It's got a nice detailed breakdown of the Crusade rules if you want to use that, and a fun little Awakening points page that you can use to keep track of your points. Fun to include some narrative stuff for some people that want to play some narrative games and use that as inspiration or a guide to follow. It's important to remember that 40k on the tabletop isn't just competitive, it's not all about the meta, it's about having fun with your mates. And if you want to play some Crusade and get wacky with it and give wounds to units that have been almost defeated in battle, or buffs, or play around with it and have fun and create your own setting, you can absolutely do that. That's what this codex is for, to create a framework for you to enjoy playing with your models on the tabletop. So that concludes my little review of this Necrons Codex. I enjoyed going through it massively. I think it's a solid start for Necrons in 10th edition. It gives us some real fun toys to play with. If you have any details or combinations or rules perhaps that I missed, get down in the comments and let me know. Tell me what your favourite thing is from the Necrons Codex, or any of the new codexes that have come out in 10th edition. Thanks for watching this breakdown. I'm also going to split this video up into 2 sections, one just for the lore and one for the rules and units, to hopefully make it more digestible. I know it's a long video, not a lot of people will have made it this far, so thank you if you did. If you'd like more coverage of rules and Warhammer 40k lore in general, let me know in the comments. More painting and kit bashing and building coming soon, so stay tuned, subscribe, and have a good one.